My name is Alexander Lukin. I'm the head of Department of International Relations and the International Laboratory on World Order Studies and the New Regionalism at National Research University High School of Economics. And we are holding our 11th session of Eurasian online seminar. And we are delighted to have today our speaker, Professor James Steinberg, who will speak on the topic COVID-19, point of no return in Sino-US relations with a question mark. So is it point of no return or not? We are not sure yet. We will be sure after the talk. Well, James Steinberg is a university professor of social science, international affairs, and law at Syracuse University, where he was dean of the Maxwell School from July 2011 until June 2016. Professor Steinberg received his AB from Harvard College and JD from Yale Law School. So he is a lawyer by education, I guess. Prior to becoming dean, he served as deputy Secretary of State, the principal deputy of state under Hillary Clinton from 2009 to 2011. From 2005 to 2008, Professor Steinberg was dean of the Lyndon Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. And before that, he was vice president and director of foreign policy studies at the Brookings Institution, where I have the honor to meet him, by the way. Professor Steinberg was Deputy National Security Advisor to President Clinton from 1996 to 2000. During that period, he also served as the president's personal representatives to several G8 summits. Prior to becoming Deputy National Secretary Advisor, he held positions as Director of the State Department's Policy Planning Staff and as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Analysis in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. He wrote several books. His most recent books are A Glass Half Full, Rebalance, Reassurance, and Resolve, and a book, Strategic Reassurance, US-China Relations in the 21st Century, both with Michael Hanlon. Well, for the first time, we have, I think, not only a scholar, but also a political, I would say, political advisor, or even, you don't have civil service. We cannot say bureaucrat or civil servant, but government official, let's say, of the United States of such a high rank. So we are very happy to have you. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and it's a great opportunity virtually. It's the new experience we're all having, and in some ways, the opportunity to do this is actually, we've discovered you can reach and talk with more people if you take advantage of the technology than sometimes we're able to do if we have to do this all in person. So thank you for taking the time. And while I'm going to talk for a bit, I do look forward to the discussion and the questions and answers, because that's always the more lively part of these discussions. So I'm going to talk about the state of Sino-US relations today, and with a particular focus on the dramatic turn of events over the last few months as a result of the outbreak of the COVID virus. But I think it's important to put this in a broader context, because while I believe very strongly that we have hit a critical moment, a true watershed in Sino-US relations, which will have a profound impact on the future course. This is not a new phenomenon, and while COVID has exacerbated some long-term trends in Sino-US relations, the trends have been brewing for some time. And so what I want to do today is talk about some of the deeper roots of the current difficulties and then explore how the specific circumstances now of the COVID outbreak are affecting the overall relationship. As I said, I think it's fair to say that this dramatic downturn in US-China relations has been a long time in coming, and there have been a number of elements that have contributed to the change in the relationship. I think if you look at it, you can see the roots of the current crisis stretching back almost 20 years at this point. And underlying this dramatic change in the relationship is a breakdown in the fundamental understanding that has been the basis for stable Sino-US relations for more than 4 decades. In shorthand, I think it's fair to say that the development of Sino-US relations since the Nixon visits and the normalization of the 1970s was based on a fairly explicit shared understanding about the roles of each of our 2 countries in the relationship. On the part of the United States, the decision beginning with Nixon and then under Carter with normalization was basically an acceptance of the idea that a successful, prosperous, and reasonably secure China was in the United States' interest, and that promoting China's success was something that was desirable for the United States rather than something that was dangerous to the United States. That was clearly a transformation from the Cold War framework, where the United States was focused on containing and weakening China. But for a variety of reasons, both geopolitical and economic, in the 1970s, American leaders began to see that actually a successful China was advantageous for the United States. In terms of security and global politics, there was the element of triangular diplomacy and how it helped the United States manage our relationships with the Soviet Union. But for many, there was an equally strong potential economic dimension in which the vision of a prosperous, increasingly middle-class China represented an opportunity for a vast new set of markets for the United States, both for US exports and for US investment. And so after several decades of trying to keep China down, the United States did a 180 and accepted the idea that actually it was desirable to support China's rise. But with that came a complementary understanding on China's side that in return for the US support in China's growth and its rise, that China would not try to challenge the US-led international order, both regionally within East Asia and more globally, that in effect, that China would accept the dominant role of the United States across the full range of issues and spectra, ranging from the US military presence in East Asia, its alliance structure in East Asia, but also the dominance of the United States in economic institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions and the like. And so this understanding, if not an explicit bargain, was basically mutually advantageous. The United States would adopt a set of policies that were advantageous for China and China's leaders, but China's leaders in turn would accept the dominant role of the United States. And through the 70s, 80s, and into the 1990s, this basic understanding took deep root. And while there were periodic challenges and crises in the relationship, most notably in 1989 as a result of Tiananmen, this basic understanding formed the core of the relationship and was very explicitly sort of reinforced by the foreign policy, the international policy pursued by Deng Xiaoping and the famous Taoguangyang Way, hide and bide approach to China's emergence on the international scene. And so that relationship and that understanding was advantageous for the United States, was advantageous for China, and it was acceptable to most of the rest of the world. It was for most of US allies. This was a way of keeping the United States engaged in East Asia without having that become a problematic set of relationships in terms of their own engagement with China. And so for South Korea and Japan and others, they were able to develop constructive relationships with China without being forced to have to choose between good relationships with China and good relationships with the United States, because China, although from time to time would verbally question the US alliance structure, as a practical matter, largely accepted it. And so this was a pretty happy arrangement, and it led to a really remarkable period in the region in which we saw the spectacular economic growth of East Asia in the context of a highly stable security environment that facilitated that economic growth. So what happened? Well, the basic understanding there, of course, was premised on the fact that that the U.S. would accept China's rise as advantageous and not threatening to the United States, and China would accept U.S. dominance as not threatening to China's interest. But as I say this with something of a smile, in some respects, that bargain had within it the seeds of its own destruction, because as China began to rise, the terms of the bargain became increasingly uncomfortable for both partners. On the part of the United States, a more successful China, let's put it the other way, a weak China didn't pose much of a threat to the United States in any dimension, security, military, or economic. And China, as a weak country, couldn't pose much of a threat to the United States even if it had wanted to. But as China began to rise and became more economically successful and had the capacity to invest more in its own security, to invest more in its own military, and to play a more consequential role in the international stage, the terms of that understanding began to fray. China began to seek a more active and determinative role on the international scene and had more capability to pursue that. And as China became more capable, both on the economic and the military dimension, the United States began to become anxious about the potential for China to challenge and even potentially threaten the United States. We saw some elements of this begin in the late 1990s, the frictions between the United States and China over Taiwan, frictions in response to the US involvement in Balkans and the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Serbia. But the tension was somewhat abated in the early 2000s by the events of 9/11 and the shared interest of the United States and China in dealing with the problem of terrorism. But that sort of brief reprieve in terms of the structural evolution of the relationship didn't last very long, and really began to come to a head at the end of the first decade of the 2000s for two principal reasons. The first, I think, was the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, 2009. And that the financial crisis had two complementary impacts on the Sino-US relationship. On the one hand, the strong impact that the crisis had on the United States and on developed Western economies led many in China to begin to believe that the era of US dominance may be coming to an end, and that fundamental weaknesses in the US economic system and political system began to herald the end of US hegemony and US dominance. At the same time, China's own success in relatively weathering the consequences of the financial crisis began to give confidence to some in China to think that China was better poised going into the future to become the dominant actor on the economic scene. And so for the first time since the 1970s, voices began to emerge in Beijing suggesting that the time had come for China to shed its deferential approach to the United States and its willingness to accept the US-led order in favor of a more assertive Chinese policy that questioned the US military role in East Asia, questioned the role of the alliances, and questioned the appropriateness of China deferring to the United States. And while that was not a universal sentiment among the leadership in China, we began to hear stronger voices emerge. And shortly after the crisis, of course, we have the leadership change in China and the emergence of the fifth generation of Chinese leaders headed by Xi Jinping, a group of leaders, and particularly Xi himself, who had shed much of the caution of the leadership of the past, and particularly of his predecessor, Hu Jintao, and the kind of collective leadership era, and began to see an opportunity for a more confident and self-assertive political leadership in Moscow from the Communist Party and from the individual leadership of Xi as president. And so this combination of factors, growing self-confidence in Beijing, growing questioning about the long-term viability of US dominance, began to upset this overall balance on the Chinese side. And similarly, voices on the United States side began to question whether the United States' willingness to accept China's rise was in the US interest. First of all, on the economic front, which in some ways drove this in the 2000s, we saw that many in the United States began to believe that China's economic success was coming at the expense of the United States, that as China rose and China's economy grew, it was coming at the cost of millions of American jobs that were lost to Chinese exports, coupled by the mercantilist economic practices in China, state-owned enterprises, subsidized exports, non-transparent economic practices that were allowing China to be economically successful at the expense of the United States, and especially at the expense of US workers. At the same time, on the security front, people in the security establishment of the United States began to watch the increasingly capable modernization of China's military and the expansion of its role, particularly as it began to develop naval capabilities, the ability to conduct blue water naval operations and to expand its activities, not just in the very near waters around China, but increasingly moving out into the South China Sea and into the Indian Ocean, all of which were increasingly seen as a potential threat by the United States. And so voices on both sides began to challenge whether that basic understanding was the right one in the first place, but certainly even if it was the right one in the past, whether it was a sustainable one in the future. And we began to hear voices in the United States questioning whether China's rise was good for the United States, and voices in China questioning whether China's tolerance of US hegemony and the US-led order was good for China. Despite that, there were still important voices in both countries that saw sustaining the relationship, although more complicated perhaps than in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, still in a shared interest. And you saw, I think, in the early years, both of President Obama and the leadership of Xi Jinping, an attempt to try to find a new basis for the relationship. We had, on the one hand, on the US side, President Obama's early visit to Beijing during the first year of his presidency, which was an attempt to see whether we could develop a more stable long-term basis for the relationship. And on the Chinese side, language and rhetoric coming out of Beijing and from President Xi about the idea of trying to develop a new model of major power relations to govern the relationship. But despite the interest, I think, on both sides, that effort to forge a new understanding between the United States and China failed during the early Obama years. And it's important to think about why that happened. If both leaders had some sense that the relationship was worth preserving and that the benefits of a constructive relationship outweighed the risks, why was it not possible to transform the traditional or the Nixon era understanding into a more updated and modern basis, which accepted the idea that China was now no longer a poor and struggling and weak country, but one where there was still enough shared interest between the United States and China to warrant developing a cooperative relationship. And I think there have been a number of arguments that have been advanced as to why that a new understanding has not been reached between the two countries. And these different theories about why we have been unsuccessful up to now have large implications for thinking about what the future might look like. The first, of course, is the kind of structural realist argument that basically argues that, rising powers inevitably are going to challenge established powers. It's inherent in the structural nature of the relationship that rising powers will seek to dethrone the dominant power and to establish an order which is more in their interest, and conversely, that the established powers ultimately will need to try to tamp down the challenge of rising powers because it threatens their privileged position. You know many of the IR theorists who've advanced this argument. It's most prominently in the more popular literature been advanced by my good friend and colleague Graham Allison and his arguments about the so-called Thucydides trap and the interpretation of Thucydides' understanding of the Peloponnesian Wars, that the rise of Athens and the fear it incited in Sparta led to the Peloponnesian Wars. So that's one explanation. It basically says this was inevitable, that the early period was a sort of a brief holiday from the inevitable structural clash between dominant and rising powers, and that we just have to accept that this is the reality, that there are different ways it might come out. The dominant power may succeed in thwarting the rising power may succeed in overthrowing the dominant power, but conflict is inevitable and we just need to get used to it, and both sides need to orient their policies to accept the inevitability of conflict. So that's one explanation for why no new understanding has emerged. A second interpretation as to why no new understanding has emerged is more ideological. The argument that while it is true that there are tensions between rising powers and established powers, we've seen in some cases that there have been successful transitions between dominant powers and rising powers that didn't lead to conflict. And the most prominent version of that, of course, is the transition between the British-led global order of the 18th and 19th centuries to the US-led order of the 20th century. And while that transition was not without some difficulties, it went pretty smoothly, and there's certainly no major conflict unless you count the War of 1812, which is not that major conflict and wasn't largely about the United States and Britain in any event. But the argument there is that the reason that that transition was successful is because of the ideological and values affinity between the United States and Great Britain, that we shared both a political system and certainly after the Reform Acts and liberalization in Britain in the mid-19th centuries, similar economic outlooks. And therefore, although there were some costs to Britain in ceding leadership to the United States, the costs were relatively minor because the order that the United States was going to establish was fairly felicitous for Britain, and it allowed Britain to avoid the cost of empire. And so Britain, with relative grace, was willing to accept this transition. But by contrast, the situation between the United States and China is very different. That China is both communist, socialist, mercantilist, that there are a whole range of values conflicts between the US and China, and that were China to become the dominant power, a China-centric, China-dominant global order would not be very felicitous for the United States. It would be threatening to US, the political system, to democracy, and to human rights and freedom. That would be threatening to the fairly open capitalist model of economic development that the United States has favored. And so for the United States, the tension posed by China's rise was one in which the idea of a China-centric order was basically going to be damaging to the US interest and therefore needed to be challenged by the United States. And so the conflict ultimately was one that had some structural roots, but was largely one driven by the ideological differences between the two systems, both in terms of their domestic political and economic order and their visions about international order and international society. That's a second explanation. Third explanation is slightly different, which says that the conflict is not inevitable, and that in fact the United States and China do have a range of common interest in terms of sustaining global economic growth and global demand, in dealing with shared challenges like climate change and pandemic disease and terrorism. But the problems of the so-called security dilemma make it hard to cooperate even when there are shared interests and even when there are potential positive sum outcomes for the two countries. That because neither side can be confident about the intentions of the other, each side needs to hedge against the possibility that the other will pursue policies which are disadvantageous. But that very act of hedging will be seen by the other side as potentially hostile and create a spiral. For those of you from the IR world out there and the work you're familiar with, Bob Jarvis and others who talked about these spiral models, which say that despite the fact that conflict is not inevitable and that there are positive sum outcomes, that these dangers and the policies that they induce create a set of actions that create a downward spiral in relations. That's a third explanation. And the fourth explanation, which is related to the third, is that the downturn in relations is driven by domestic political factors. That there are forces in both countries, a combination of nationalism, a combination of those affected by globalization in particular, are driving and who've been harmed by the emergence of global society and China's increasing role, are now become the focal points of domestic politics, and that leaders and potential leaders in both countries need to address and be responsive to these domestic political factors, which are unfavorable to continued cooperative, constructive US-China relations. So 4 explanations for why no agreement has been reached. They're not mutually incompatible. In some cases, they exist side by side. But the combination of all of them have created a situation in which managing the Sino-US relationship is very difficult. And that was absolutely true. And we saw this in the 2016 election in the United States, in which, as Sasha and I were talking about beforehand, we saw President Trump make quite a lot of successful efforts in raising the China issue as part of his campaign theme about the need to have a more vigorous policy to contest China across a range of different issues, from the economic issues and trade to security issues. And so even before COVID, we saw that these tensions were continuing to mount and that managing the relationship was difficult. Nonetheless, there was still, I think, going into 2017, 2018, still a glimmer of hope that there might be a way to be found to manage these relationships. But now we see on top of this the outbreak of the COVID crisis. On one level, one could argue, gee, this ought to be the one thing that could convince both leaders and publics in both countries that the shared interest in dealing with transnational problems far outweighs the zero-sum conflictual parts of the relationship, and reminds us that countries acting in autarkic and nationalistic ways are not going to be able to meet many of the great challenges of our time. And so if one had looked at this ex ante in sort of December of 2019, one might say, aha, this is the one thing that will bring us all together and remind us that actually we have a great need for countries large and small to cooperate. But instead, what we've seen is actually a dramatic deepening of the tensions between the two countries. And rather than seeing this as an opportunity to cooperate, we've seen this as a moment in which the blame game and the sense of rivalry and conflict has now begun to overwhelm the relationship. We saw this early on in terms of the questions about whether China was going to be willing to accept help from the outside, and particularly from the United States, in dealing with the initial outbreak, in which the insecurities of the leadership in China and the sense of vulnerability if they were to depend on outside help and support, which would question the Chinese leadership's own capacity to deal with this question, led China to stiff-arm offers of help from the international community and from international expertise in the early days of the outbreak in December and January. And then quickly on the United States side, as the infection began to spread to the United States, a growing sense of blame and pointing of responsibility on China and China's failure to deal transparently and openly with the crisis in its early goings, now being seen as the cause of the global pandemic. And though I'm not one much for slides, I'm going to show you one, if I can. Sasha, can you allow me to put something up through screen share? I'm just going to show some polling results.
Sure, Professor. Right, you can do this by clicking on the green point.
Yeah, it says it's disabled.
Really? Oh,
you've got me disabled from participant screen sharing.
Please try it right now.
Okay.
Can you try it once again? I think it should work.
I got it now. Yeah, let me see if I can find it now.
Mm-hmm.
There we go. Well, it's not. Unfortunately, no, it's not coming up here on my.
Can you find the button?
No, I have the button, but now my clip has disappeared.
Oh.
Let me see. It's not there anymore. I had it set up for you. Well, all right, I will describe it since I can't seem to find it on this here now. Let me try one thing. All right, well, I will describe it to you. So what we have is according to the Pew poll on attitudes towards the United States and China, as late as 2016, the attitudes of the people in the United States towards China were about equally divided. 47% had a unfavorable view of China, 44% had a favorable view of China. But in 2018, that began to diverge a bit. 47% unfavorable, that's about the same. The favorable went down to 38%. But then, in the last 9 months, in 2020, the number of unfavorable has grown from 47% to 66% unfavorable in the United States. And the number of favorable has dropped from 44% to 26%. That number is the lowest it has been since Pew has been taking these polls, lower than at the time of Tiananmen and the real downturn in U.S. relations since the 1990s. And clearly that, as I say, although the negative numbers began to decline during the first part of the Trump administration, they have dramatically declined since then. And we see most dramatically in the last 24 hours in the back and forth at the WHO meeting, that, as I said, that rather than seeing this as an opportunity for everybody to step back and say, gee, we have our differences, but we have an imperative to work together on this crisis, we see not only deep tensions between the United States and China at the WHO and at other international fora like the G20, but also increasingly effort of both sides to try to polarize the international debate and try to get countries to line up on one side or the other as the contention becomes not just between our two countries, but increasingly starting to resemble the kinds of Cold War block-to-block confrontations that we saw before the Nixon opening and back in the period of Sino-US relations during the height of the Cold War. And the question then becomes, if the pandemic is not a reason for us to come together and to see the shared interest as reasons to at least moderate the differences, if not try to find ways to overcome them, then what hope is there for us over the long term to restore any stable basis for the relationship? And I regret to say my prognosis is fairly gloomy, because it's hard to see what is the trigger, what are the set of events, if it's not this, that would cause each side to come back from the brink. And you hear increasingly voices now on the United States side saying that we need to find ways to reduce our dependence on China, to reduce our trade with China, to reduce the spread of modern technologies to China, to try to begin to erect the kinds of barricades that we saw during the Cold War and the COCOM regime, in which Western countries sought to deny technology to the Soviet Union and the bloc, to decrease people-to-people exchanges and students coming between China and the United States. And as those voices grow in the United States, an increasingly nationalist set of voices on the Chinese side as well. And because of the depths of this and the depths of the suspicion, not just at the leadership level, but at the broader public levels, certainly in the United States, and we have anecdotal reasons to believe that this is being mirrored by sentiments in China, the question is it now possible to build a new consensus? And while I think in the 3 or 4 years ago, because our publics had not turned so negative on the bilateral relationship, it was possible that if two leaders made a concerted effort to turn this ship around and to try to move it in a different direction, there was enough underlying public support to support that in terms of the domestic politics of both countries. I think the challenge, now that the tensions have spread beyond the elites to the publics, makes it more difficult. Now, do I think it's impossible? No. Reason being largely because there are important shared interests between the United States and China, both in terms of bilateral interest and global interest. In the long run, it will be harder to sustain global economic growth if the United States and China are not cooperating. It will be harder to meet transnational challenges like climate change and pandemic disease if the two countries are not cooperating. But it is not something that can be done just with a wave of a hand, or even with an election in the United States that brings a different leader or a different leader in China itself. It will now take a much more sustained effort, and it will take significant steps by both sides to demonstrate to each other that there is a serious and sustainable commitment to turn the relationship around. That will be hard to accomplish, and it will take really a significant act of statesmanship, I think, in both countries, and significant leadership to not only move the elite debate, but also the public debate in a different direction. So let me stop with that, and let's turn to the questions and discussion.
Just a second, I will turn the sound on.
Okay, thank you very much. This was most interesting. We have quite a few questions already. How about Professor Karaganov? Do you want to?
Yeah, thank you. Jim, it was a great talk, and in spite of all possible differences caused by geography, I must say that largely I agree to your assessments. I understand that you are cautious on some of the edges, but that is our life. But my question is about long term. You said that, and you make conclusions that it is the China-US confrontation, whatever you call it, is for long. But one of the reasons of this confrontation, which you didn't mention for obvious reasons, is that the United States could not adapt to the situation of their not only superpower. It was infected with this virus in the 90s and early 2000s. But the United States has a very short history of being even a great power. Before the Second World War, it was a powerful power, but not one of the greatest. Don't you think that the country could return to its basic roots of being a great power, I mean, a great democratic power, but not a global power responsible for everything? That is, for my personal reason, that is the main reason of your confrontation with China. I'm not questioning your argument, by the way.
Right. Well, very a good point, Sergey. And you and I have talked about this many times before. I mean, my only response to that is that, you know, at the beginning of the Obama administration and during that first year in 2009, I think President Obama very much understood the dynamic that you're discussing and understood that the period of, you know, the hyperpower, the sole hegemon, was not a sustainable role for the United States and not in the United States' interest. And under President Obama and Secretary Clinton, for the first year of the Obama administration, there was really a concerted effort to try to think about building a new kind of relationship with China. And that first trip that Obama took to Beijing in the fall of 2009 was fairly unprecedented for a US president to go to China during the first year of his presidency. And we took a number of steps during that year to really make clear to the Chinese leadership that we were prepared to give China a bigger role in the international community and to see a different kind of relationship emerge. Unfortunately, and this is obviously my view, and I've discussed this with Chinese counterparts over the years, it came at the wrong time because it came during the financial crisis. There were many in China who reached the conclusion that the United States was on the decline in any event, and that China didn't have to make a lot of accommodations to the United States or prop up the United States, and China could just kind of let the natural course of events happen, that the United States would decline, China would rise. And so rather than sort of picking up the opportunity that the Obama administration offered, it wasn't rejected by China, but there was just sort of an unwillingness to take it up. I think part of the problem too was China was in its own period of transition, moving from the Hu Jintao era, it was the last years of Hu's leadership, and to beginning moving into the next party Congress. And so you didn't have kind of the boldness that might have been had Deng Xiaoping still been the supreme leader in China, that might have been able to do that. And so an opportunity was missed during that period of time. And relationships took a fairly quick downturn after that. So I do think that your point is right. I mean, that in order to have a long-term relationship, the United States had to accept the idea that it was not going to be the sole superpower. But I think there was a willingness to do that. But unfortunately, it wasn't effectively picked up by the Chinese leadership. And then 2 years later, when President Xi began to talk about a new model of major power relations, and the so-called Sunnylands dialogue began between President Xi and President Obama, the moment had more or less passed. There were still some efforts during the Obama administration. The visit of Xi Jinping in 2015, in theory, when they reached some agreements on cyber and the South China Sea, were also important moments when the relationship might have been stabilized. But I fully accept your view that it would have required a modification on the US side of our own global role. But it also would have required China to accept the fact that the United States wasn't going away, and that while the United States might not be the sole hegemon, it was still going to be a great power. We're still going to want to have a big voice on the global stage.
One addition, if I may, I mean, Russia has had the same problem. I mean, it wanted to skip its role as a global power, but then it has skipped the role of a great power. But we restored the role of the great power and we are content. But could the United States come to a role of a great power and be content with this position in the world? It's not only vis-a-vis China, by the way. It's vis-a-vis many other countries, including my own.
You know, I think there are many voices in the United States, both conservative and liberal, Republican, Democrat, who, I mean, including Trump himself in some levels, you know, who don't want to be the provider of global public goods. I mean, if you look at some of the aspects of the Trump policy, it is a much less engaged global role. So I think there is plenty of public support for the United States not to feel that it has to be the global superpower. But at the same time, you know, as you say, I mean, the United States is not going to step back from being a forceful player on the international stage.
Well, thank you. I think I'll have a question, kind of follow-up question, because you sounded very pessimistic. Do you think that there can be a change in China policy if Democrats come to power? Will their policy be somehow different from the Republicans? Because at the moment we can see only kind of competition, anti-Chinese competition kind of, but sometimes it doesn't matter too much what people say before the election and after that.
It's a great question, and I'd make a couple of points. First, you're quite right. You know, many years ago, I wrote a book with Kurt Campbell that talked about the role of foreign policy during campaigns and during the periods of transition. And it's very difficult. Domestic politics makes thoughtful foreign policy making difficult. And for all of the modern period, China has been an especially difficult issue during American presidential campaigns. If you go back even to the 1970s, during the period of normalization, when Reagan first challenged Nixon in 1976, he challenged the China policy. When Reagan ran against Carter in 1980, he challenged the China policy. Many of you will remember the 1992 campaign, which I was involved in which President Clinton challenged President Bush over being too soft on China. And later in 2000, the next soon-to-be President Bush challenged President Clinton for being too soft on China. So campaigns always, I think, bring out a certain degree of competition for who can be tougher and more vigorous in defending US interests. And it is also true that even with Reagan, if you look at it, who had a very tough line in 76 and 80, Reagan was the president who signed the third communique with China, promising to reduce the level of arms sales to Taiwan. So there is typically a period after the election in which some of the vitriol declines. But I don't think this is a question of Democrats versus Republicans. I don't think that there's a particularly more supportive role towards constructive Sino-US relations among Democrats and Republicans, or among Republicans versus Democrats. I think some of the focus is different. Democrats are more interested in trade and human rights issues and perhaps less worried on the security front. But I wouldn't say that this is a partisan issue. And therefore, I would not assume that just a change of party in the White House would lead to changes in the relationship between the United States and China. I think it will take a very concerted effort by leaders on both sides to turn this around. And in particular, and I don't want to sound like this is an American shirking responsibility, it would be particularly important, whoever wins this election in November, for the Chinese leadership to make a clear demonstration that it doesn't want to continue down the road that we're going down, because it will take political risk on both sides to change the direction. It will take leaders on both sides who are willing to be challenged to be more accommodative of the two sides' interests. And particularly in the aftermath of the election, I don't think that's going to be coming from the US side. I think it will take a clear signal from the Chinese leadership that it wants to take advantage of having the election behind us to try to find a new path forward.
Right. Thank you. We have a question from Richard Waite from the United States. I'm very happy to give a platform for your internal discussions here from Russia. Richard,
yeah, it involves Russia too. But so the question I had was, yesterday we heard the Trump administration say, basically say it's going to demand that China join Russia-U.S. strategic arms control limitations, or else it's just not going to continue working alone with Russia. And I think it makes, it makes a lot of sense for, among other reasons. I can't see the Senate ratifying another arms control treaty if it doesn't include China as well. But the Chinese, understandably would rather just have these limits apply only to Washington and Moscow. So the question I had was, is there any combination of pressure and incentives that might induce a Chinese change of mind?
Richard, good to hear from you, and it's been a pleasure to work with you on many projects in the past. I mean, I think that as a practical matter, arms control agreements that involve the United States and Russia and don't involve China now are not sustainable. China is too consequential in terms of its military capability. And I mean, even putting aside the difficulty of getting it ratified by the Senate, it just doesn't make any sense for, as it was the case with INF, for the United States and Russia to bind themselves to limitations that don't apply to China, because China's own missile capabilities are of great concern to the United States, and especially to U.S. allies in East Asia and to the U.S. presence in East Asia. So some understanding has to be reached. My own view is it's almost unimaginable that we're going to have any formal arms control agreements of any type that are negotiable and ratifiable in this domain. And that rather what we need to look for and work to are informal arrangements and understandings around restraint on various kinds of weapon systems that don't require all the minutiae and the agony of the formal negotiations, but demonstrate each side's recognition that some systems can be destabilizing and that it's in our common interest to reduce or eliminate those systems. I think informal arms control is the way to go. It's difficult, but in some ways less difficult than the formal agreements, and can provide a measure of confidence and reassurance that's achievable without all the political drama that goes along with formal arms control. It also allows for taking steps that are reciprocal bilateral steps that can be reflected by third parties, taking into account the understandings of the two. And so if the United States and Russia could reach some kinds of understandings about what it would do if China were willing to go along, then you could imagine the Chinese, as a unilateral decision, exercising restraint or modifying its modernization programs without having to go through the formal process of negotiation. I can't say I'm hugely optimistic, but I think that's more promising than some kind of formal conference of a la 70s, 80s arms control agreements.
Thank you. We have a question from Sergei Trush, who was also at the Brookings. I think it was before your time, but he was the first Synops, in the first Synops group, actually. Sergei?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, James, for your very interesting talk. And I'm glad we also have Brookings bond, though we were in different periods, probably. My question pertains to the understanding of Trump's policy to China, and there is understanding that since Trump was not so much motivated by the manifold factors in his China policy. Economy factor was one of the key and the most driving force for his strategies towards China. And there is understanding that there is a certain difference inside the United States between the general economy, between the, on the one side, the big corporations that are involved in globalized business and are basing their business on the value chains involved with China being a key role in this. And on the one side, this is on the one side. On the other side, the more traditional American economy, mainly focused on internal market and not so much globalized, not so much based on the value chains. And in this realm, having serious income disparities between the big globalized corporations and those who are working in internal economy. So would you comment on this, please? And also there was a lot of speculations during the period of trade negotiations with China on the serious disputes between the members of the US team on the negotiations between Mnuchin, Lighthizer, Navarro, Ross, all that. So to what extent these speculations are true, and to what extent they are reflecting the real, these contradictions between different sectors of US economy? Thank you.
Great questions. And, I need to preface this all by saying I have no particular, inside, window into the Trump administration. I'm not close to them and don't have my own conversations with them. So what I see is what you see from the outside. But I do think it's right to say that there are different strains or levels of approach within the Trump administration that reflect different views about what the nature of the relationship with China is and what the objectives of the relationship with China. I think there's a part of the Trump administration, and I think this is largely the president himself from what I can see, which is largely transactional, that basically doesn't have strong feelings about China as a friend or a foe. It basically sees dealings with China the way the president sees dealings with everybody else, which is trying to get the best deal for the United States and to use American power and leverage to achieve that deal by getting economic trade, investment concessions from partners, by using the leverage of the American economy to gain benefits for American firms and American workers. There's no strong ideological component. There's not even a strong geopolitical component to it. It's just, how do I get the best deal? And you can see that by the fact that in many ways, how Trump has approached China is not that different than how he's approached Mexico or Japan or Europe or anybody else, which is, he's very explicit. It's America first. I'm trying to get a good deal for us, and that's what I'll do. And if they give me a good deal, I can have a good relationship with them. And if they don't, then we're going to have a difficult relationship. So I think that's one strand of the policy. And I think certainly, what you see from the Treasury Department and others tends to follow that line, which is, concerned about Chinese trade barriers, investment barriers, IP theft, all these things. But if China would just rectify those problems, then the relationship would be fine. And then I think there are other elements of the administration which view the relationship as inherently adversarial and hostile. And the goal would be to try to eliminate US dependence on China and to weaken China's ability to compete against the United States across the full range, to compete economically, to compete technologically, to compete militarily. And I think that's what you hear from Navarro and others, which basically says, one, we should decouple, and two, we should try to minimize China's ability to gain any advantage through the international trade and finance system. And that's a very different approach that sees the relationship as inherently conflictual, and that the United States should try to defeat China. And that is the only outcome that's good for China. And then there are some who are motivated along the ideological lines. We hear some of that from the Secretary of State. And so the policy is an amalgam of all those, where at the end of the day, the president makes the decisions. I mean, you can have different voices, but what we've seen fairly regularly from the president is that if China accommodates his principal concerns, the president is not hostile to US-China relations and would like to, on the whole, find ways to move forward. It will be hard to do that in an election campaign, but I certainly, as I say, I think for the president himself, that transactional objective is the dominant one. More broadly in the United States, I mean, it is certainly true that we have a strong domestic economy and a lot of the jobs are rooted in the domestic economy, but it's still hard for me to see that the United States can sustain any level of growth without significant opportunities to participate in the international trade and investment system. I mean, it's got to be done with more awareness of how it affects Americans as opposed to American corporations. That is, the problem with a lot of the globalization of the 2000s and that period is American firms were doing well, but American workers weren't doing well. And all the things you said about income equality and job loss. And so you got the big firms, the technology firms, the Apples, the Amazons, the Facebooks, doing very well, but that wasn't really benefiting very many Americans. And so we can't, in my own view, we can't succeed by being autarkic the way Navarro and others seem to want to do. But the American people aren't going to support it if the only people who are getting rich are the Bezoses and the Tim Cooks and people like that, as opposed to ordinary Americans. And so there'll have to be a new approach to globalization along the lines of people like Danny Roddick and others who've been talking about that are more conscious of the fact that, yes, interdependence, yes, trade, yes, international investment, but ways that are conscious about, who are the ultimate beneficiaries of that international economic engagement.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Dr. Olga Krasniak from our department. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. James, thank you very much for your insights into Sino-American relations. And my question is about American strategy towards its Asian allies and partners. I used to live in South Korea for 12 years and I'm back to Moscow just recently. And I was just looking inside from these Korean-American relations. And of course, they're dependent on China. And now I see some sort of a polarization in Korean society, for example, and they're just trying to move maybe towards China because this economic interdependency or even maybe dependency and so on and so forth. So it's my question. So what do you think about the change in American strategy and yes, in Trump administration as well towards its American partners and allies? Thank you.
Right. Well, it's a great question, and I too spent a lot of time in South Korea, and I think it is an important test case for the evolution both of U.S. policy and the region as a whole. I mean, I think, just specifically on Trump, and going back to the earlier conversation, the president has a very transactional view about South Korea too, which is, yeah, we're committed to South Korean security, but only if they pay us to do it, and the burden sharing issue is dominant, and the demands that the president has made on South Korea for burden sharing are unprecedented in a scale that we've never seen before. And it reflects a view that the president is deeply skeptical about the value of alliance relationships and sees them as much as entrapment as opposed to a benefit to the United States. I don't think that view is broadly shared in the United States. I actually think that beyond the president, that most Americans and certainly most foreign policy leaders in both parties actually see this as a huge advantage to the United States, even with different views about how it fits into the overall relationship with China. I mean, for the hawks, it's critical because it's a way of balancing China and important to keep South Korea in the US camp. But even for people who have a more constructive view about US-China relations, we still have a huge benefit from these relations, both in dealing with North Korea and with China. And so, yes, we should have fair burden sharing, but we need to keep in mind the broader relationship. So I think Trump's view and his questioning about the alliance relationships, both in East Asia and Europe, is not mainstream. I don't think, and I do think that I hesitate to predict about changes if there were elections, but it's hard for me to believe that a Biden presidency would be as critical of allies as the Trump presidency has been. But on South Korea, it's interesting because, you know, there are lots of reasons why South Koreans are both concerned about US attitudes and very dependent and very conscious of the need to have good relations with China. But I have to say that China has handled the relationship abysmally, right? And if you look at the fallout from the THAAD deployments and China's very heavy-handed approach by threatening latte and threatening South Korean students, then the public opinion in China has turned in Korea has also turned much more negative about China in recent years because of the heavy-handed wolf warrior diplomacy that we're seeing coming out of China. And so while many South Koreans are very conscious of their interdependence, would like to have a good relationship with China, I think they're growing much more worried that a China-dominant region is one in which China is going to pursue its interests at the expense of others. And so for the US, this is an opportunity. If we treat South Korea respectfully, I think South Korea doesn't want to fall into a Chinese sphere of influence because it's seen in recent years what happens when China was unsupportive after the sinking of the Chonan by North Korea, and China did not support South Korea. As I say, the THAAD and the latte stuff, Chinese actions in the Yellow Sea, in which China has been challenging South Korean fishing, South Korean territorial limits. So China has been pretty heavy-handed in its management of Sino-South Korean relations, which means that I think there's a lot of wariness in South Korea about being too dependent on China.
All right, thank you. Now we have a question from Professor Alexander Zebit from University of Rio de Janeiro, who is joining us from Brazil.
Wow.
Professor Zebit.
Hello from Brazil. Thank you, Professor James Steinberg, for your interesting lecture. I have two brief questions. First, was China's joining the BRICS in 2009 estimated in the United States as a challenge to the US-led world order? And second, are the growing Sino-Russian relations being viewed at the United States as a game changer in major power relationships? Does the COVID-19 change such a scenario? Thank you.
Well, they're two great questions. And I think the answer is that attitudes are mixed. I think that there were some people in the United States who saw the formation of the BRICS as a challenge to the US-led order. I think, you know, within the Obama administration, we were not too deeply troubled by that. I think it was understood that as a sort of a signal to the United States that we should not take other countries for granted, that it was a signal we needed to pay attention to. But I think we had enough confidence in our relationships with each of the countries who were members of the BRICS not to see this as somehow as an alternative to the US-led order and not something to get terribly anxious about. I mean, in some ways, the same debate took place in the United States over the establishment of the AIIB, the Chinese-led Asian Infrastructure Bank. There were some people who thought this was China trying to challenge the ADB and the World Bank, and others who said, no, it's, you know, there's room for a lot of different approaches. And so those forces in the United States, which were inherently worried about confrontation with China and saw China as a threat, saw BRICS and other things as a potential threat, but others just sort of understood this as kind of a natural attempt for other countries to show that they weren't totally dependent on the United States. And the fact that you had countries like India and Brazil in the BRICS, I think made it more reassuring to the United States than had it just been countries that the United States was more worried about. I certainly think, you know, from President Obama's point of view, had enough confidence in Brazil and South Africa and India and our relations with them not to see this as somehow a hostile act against the United States. Now on the Sino-Russian relationship, both Richard and I have done a lot of work in this. I participated in a book and wrote an article about this last year on this question. There's no doubt in the political discourse and the inside the Beltway view that there's growing anxiety, a concern about Sino-Russian relations and seeing this as somehow an anti-US formation of a new alliance of authoritarians, and a lot of very heated rhetoric about that. And I think that there, certainly in the political class, there's a concern that this is a long-term challenge to the United States. It's not one that I'm as concerned about. I mean, I think there are some problems in this relationship for the United States, but I think that in some ways our own overreaction to this can make it more undesirable than it would otherwise be. I think that we need to be conscious about the fact that there are factors that are driving China and Russia closer together. But many of them have nothing to do with US policy. Many of them have to do with developments both within Russia and China that would take place irrespective of what US policy was. And some of it obviously have to do with the different views about values in the international system. And for me, if the consequence of the United States being an advocate for democracy and human rights means that it will push China and Russia closer together, so be it. I mean, that's something that we need to be prepared to live with because it's important enough to the United States. But I think that that alone is not going to lead to some kind of geopolitical alignment. And that what's important is for us to realize that we have tensions over those issues. But if we understand that there are many other issues that all need to work together, that those tensions can be managed. But if we sort of see this as an emergence of a new Cold War set of alignments, it will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that does concern me.
Thank you. The next question is from Alexandra Bocharova, who is moderating our conference today, but she is also a graduate student here at High School of Economics studying China. And her question is about Hong Kong, which is very interesting because just today I read about this new legislation that China is going to pass on Hong Kong. Alexandra.
Okay, thank you very much for your lecture. It was really interesting to listen to. And I would like to ask a question concerning the Hong Kong situation, taking into consideration the new security law that is going to be imposed by China and the protests that started since summer 2019. How can the Hong Kong card played by US and by China in the future international relations, in the future dialogue or confrontation?
So I think this set of developments is not surprising, but extremely unfortunate. I think it demonstrates the fact that for the Chinese leadership, the internal control of the Communist Party is the paramount concern. And even if that imposes cost in its relationship with other countries, so be it, right? And the reason it concerns me is because it does demonstrate that the leadership now basically doesn't care that much about how others react to all of this. And to take this step, again, you understand from their point of view the timing with the NPC and the fact that with the end of the lockdown in Hong Kong, the possibility of protests again emerging, have motivated the Chinese leadership to fire this shot across the bow. But it's come in the middle of a US presidential campaign, couldn't be worse timing. This will become a big issue. We've already seen the strong action in the US Congress within 24 hours among Democrats and Republicans getting together to condemn this. And, I don't think the Chinese leadership cares, but it's just one more reason why my assessment about the difficulty of putting US-China relations on a right path is going to be so difficult, because if these are the paramount concerns of the Chinese leadership and it's prepared to do these things no matter how the rest of the world feels about it, then the path forward in US-China relations just becomes all the more difficult. So what we see, I think, in both countries is, strong attentiveness to domestic political interests and indifference to the broader ramifications. So, I am worried about this because up till now, I think Americans have viewed the situation in Hong Kong with concern, but it has not become a flashpoint in Sino-US relations. But I think on top of the COVID controversy, This is just adding fuel to the fire, and it will become, I think, quite a big issue in the months leading up. I think you will see the Congress adopting legislation to punish China, which will be supported by the president. He's not going to stand in the way of it. And it just becomes one more barrier that will need to be overcome if we want to try to move Sino-American relations in a different direction. And it will be hard for China to reverse course. I mean, once having taken the step, how does China change direction? And so, this is my deep concern, is each step down this path becomes harder and harder to undo, and more costly for each side to move in a different direction. And so this is, I think, again, not surprising. I don't think there's anything about the timing of this that should surprise us or shock us, but it does just continue to foretell further and further difficulties in the bilateral relationship.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next question is from General Banerjee from India.
Yes. What an excellent analysis. With the rise of China a reality now, and we see Kurt Campbell's and Rush Joshi's article in the Foreign Affairs recently, and just the other day, 2 days ago, we had Kishore Mahbubani speaking at this forum regarding Has China Won? Are we likely to see the enactment of the Thucydides trap scenario in the East Asian area, particularly in the South China Sea? With China's position there now fairly formidable, they have secured these islands in the Spratlys and the Paracels, established political control. Are we likely to see a possible misunderstanding between China and the rest in the region and outside with America, and possible conflict there? Thank you.
Well, I do think there's a serious danger of conflict there. I mean, I think the puzzle to me about China's rise is China's aggressive strategy in establishing its growing power and influence. This seems to me, if there were a really confident Chinese leadership, this would be the moment to cultivate soft power and to try to provide reassurance to others that China's growth was not threatening to them. Even if the long-term intention was entirely not benign, right? Even if the goal was to have a Pax Sinica in which everybody was a tributary state, wouldn't the right strategy now be to be reassuring, to tell neighbors, look, you can count on us, our being a power is a good thing. And yet we see none of that, right? And the South China Sea is a classic example of that. Just in the last 3 months, we've seen an incredible expansion of really forceful Chinese patrolling in the Philippines, off Malaysia, off Indonesia, off Vietnam. I mean, and why? I mean, if you don't want people to balance against you, and you don't want to play into the hardliners' hands in the United States and drive other countries into supporting the United States and being wary of China, why now? Why would you do this now? Just as in our earlier conversation, we were talking about the Chinese reaction to THAAD and the bullying of South Korea, now the bullying of Australia. And I mean, it's curious to me. I mean, you can construct an explanation about why the leadership feels it needs to address domestic constituents. But if China is so good at playing the long game, you'd think that the CCP would be able to manage the domestic audience well enough not to, raise all these red flags among the neighbors and for India and others, right? I mean, this is just, it foretells a world in which China's rise is not good for the rest of the world. And it will lead others, even in the short term, if they have to accommodate China to some extent, it will leave them resentful, angry, unsupportive. And I don't see how that advantages China. But we also see very little sign that China is moderating its behavior in that respect. And so, the days of, the peaceful rise seem to be over. And that strategy that we saw during the Hu Jintao era being replaced by a highly self-confident and somewhat indifferent set of Chinese external policies that certainly, security dilemma is based on a fear that's not supported by actions. But, you know, even paranoids have enemies, right, as they say. And in this case, people and countries are entitled to draw adverse conclusions from China's behavior about China's long-term intentions. And I certainly would not be critical for countries in the region saying what we see now requires us to take precautionary measures against China's policy.
Well, I think we have two more questions, and then we'll let you have a little rest. The next one is Anna Kireyeva from GIMO University here in Russia, in Moscow. Anna.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your lecture. My question is, what do you think could be considered the desired outcome of the American policy vis-a-vis China, especially if we take into consideration structural factors that you mentioned that predetermine strategic competition? So what could the outcome that will be in the US interests now would look like? Thank you.
It's a great question, and it's probably easier for me to describe what I think it ought to be than to figure out how we would actually get to be there. But I think, you know, on our part, and following a bit of Sergei Karaganov's question, the United States has to accept the fact that we cannot dictate the terms of the global order, that we have to take into account the views of others, and that in particular we have to take into account the views of China. That China is simply too powerful and consequential to be ignored, or to be left to be a taker of policy rather than a shaper of policy. And so that we have to, both in our bilateral relations and in the development of international and regional institutions, recognize that China will have a significant voice that must be taken into account in any international arrangements. But in order for the United States to accept that role for China, China has to be willing to take a number of steps that accept the fact that it too has to recognize that other countries have key interests which it needs to accommodate. And in particular, one, it has to recognize the fact that the United States is not going to willingly accede to a Chinese sphere of influence in East Asia, in which China basically determines the fate of the countries in the region, and the United States has to back off. The United States will maintain its alliances and its relationships with key countries in the region. It will sustain a military presence in the region, and it will insist on certain understandings about the principles of international law and international order that can't simply be dictated by power. That sort of mutual accommodation, I think, is potentially a basis to allow the two countries to cooperate on shared interests, like dealing with pandemic disease and dealing with climate change and piracy and international crime and the like, and to allow for the development of not only constructive bilateral relations, but more effective regional and global institutions that are more multilateral in character, more multipolar in character, but are respectful of the interests of all the parties in question. Can that accommodation be reached? You know, it's easier to say than to do, but I think that ought to be the objective. And I think each side needs to be clear about what it's prepared to accommodate in terms of the other's interest and what it can't accommodate, and to see whether there's enough overlap between those two positions to allow for a long-term relationship.
Thanks. The last question is from Alexei Nikitin, who is concerned about human rights in China, I guess. Alexei.
Yes, thank you very much for your lecture. And I think I have a question about human rights in China and its impact on United States-Chinese relations. President Clinton in 1993 tried to link the issue of China's observance of human rights and most favored nation status, but a year later, he admitted that his policy failed. And what do you think, in your opinion, levels of influence should America use now to force China to respect human rights? And is this even possible? Thank you.
So I think the key is in your use of the word force, because I think that's the wrong framework to think about this problem. And I think, you know, I was very personally involved in that whole set of issues in the early years of the Clinton administration. I've recently written an article in the Texas National Security Review about this. And I think, you know, the lesson we learned there is that even when China was much weaker than it was today, that there were some things that were so fundamental to the Communist Party and the communist leadership in China that they weren't going to exceed outside pressure, even if they had to eat grass. And so, you know, if our goal is, as the Trump administration has said, to end the communist leadership in China, there's nothing short of invasion of China and occupation that's going to bring that about, and we need to understand that. So we need to think about how we can be true to our values while recognizing that we're not going to force the Chinese leadership to do anything. We could, I mean, there's literally no lever that we have short of invasion and occupation, which would be, by the way, lead to a nuclear holocaust, that would bring that about. But it is also the case that doesn't mean we have to simply say it's all fine. We do need to speak out about these issues. We do need to continue to find ways to, you know, make sure that information about the outside world can continue to get into China. We need to have American leaders continue to express their views about the repression of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang and what the realities in Tibet and the opportunities and the closing off of information to the people of China, and to continue to support and work with people who are working against that. But it has to be done with the recognition at the end of the day that the change will come internally in China. I believe it will come, by the way. I mean, I do believe that, and I've spent a good part of my last 25 years in China, working with people in China, that the Chinese people have the same aspirations of everybody else, to be able to speak their mind, to worship what they want to worship, to, you know, have access to the information that they want to have access to. And that over time, that even with all the modern tools of technological repression, that the human spirit will win out. And so we have to remain a beacon of that. We have to be unshy about criticizing practices that we think that's wrong, but not make the test about whether we can force China and China's leadership to do something that they don't believe in. They don't. But over time, I believe that they won't be able to sustain their own control if they don't accommodate ultimately what the people of China themselves will ultimately want for themselves.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Professor Steinberg, for sharing your insightful thoughts with us. And we need some time to think about it seriously. But this was most interesting, and you see that we had a lot of questions. I hope that we can see you in person one day in Moscow or China or the United States when we're allowed to travel. But at the moment, this is the only thing we can do, the online seminars that we are doing. Well, thank you very much. And
thank you, and thanks to everybody participating. This was terrific and great questions. And I wish you all health and safety. And I do look forward to, I'm confident that we will once again be able to all meet in person somewhere.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much.